Give me one sec. So when we look at the heart, we divide the heart into segments or regional walls. And it's very important to understand what we're talking about. And the reason why we do this is because of the different blood supply to the different areas. Um, so we are going to divide the heart into segments. These are uh, little areas that are distinct, okay, and it usually supplied by one or more of the coronary arteries. And when we're looking at, say, a heart attack, we can look at a segment, and if that segment is not moving, we can sort of predict the blood vessel that is involved in causing that coronary event. All right, so regional walls is very important again. So let me start by saying when we take the heart, so if you look right here, the heart is lying down and we can bread loaf the heart. We're just cutting it in. You guys are not.
Hello.
Okay,
We
all right.
cannot see anything in here.
Okay.
No, we're not seeing anything.
Okay, good. All right. So if you look here, you can see this heart. So now you guys can see. So if you look, the heart is is lying flat on the surface. And when we bread loaf it, we can cut from the apex straight to the base. We can cut from the apex straight to the base, just like we're cutting a loaf of bread. Okay? And we can look at the different walls or segments. Let's start at the base. And I'm gonna draw this so that you guys sort of appreciate it. Okay. So if we start at the base of the heart, all right, I'll tell you what, let me go back a little bit because I want you guys have to get this. All right, so if we start at the base of the heart, remember the base of the heart, that's where you have the mitral valve. You remember that? And all right, so we're gonna draw it. So if we cut, remember now we're bread in the heart. And if we cut the heart at the base where we have the mitral valve, okay, it's gonna look like this. It's gonna look like this. And of course the mitral valve gonna be inside there. We can draw it as well as, we don't have to draw it. So this is at the base. And let me just put it base. So the base is where you have the mitral valve. Okay. All right. So if we bread loaf the heart, cut it into short axis segments, we can divide this base into 6 segments. And I'm going to show you how we do it. So we divide it into 6 segments. Okay. Okay. So this is what we call the anterior segment. It's on top, so anterior, that's appropriate. So the anterior segment, we just use A to designate it. And then this is the inferior segment. It's below the inferior segment. And over here, I've been telling you, it's the lateral. This is the lateral wall. And this is the anterior lateral wall. So we can use AL to designate this, AL. And then this is again, it's a lateral wall, so this would be the inferior lateral wall down here. Inferior lateral wall. So let's designate it IL. Okay, and over here is the septum. Over here is the septum. this is the anterior septum because it's closer to the anterior wall. So we can call this anterior septum. So we can designate this AS. Okay, this is the inferior septum because it's a septum, but it's closer to the inferior wall. So we can designate this IS, inferior septum. So IS. So this is at the base. Now remember, now your bread loaf in the heart, the base is right up here. So further down, you're gonna get the mid segment, and the mid segment, that's where you have your papillary muscles. So you remember that, okay? At the mid segment, that's where you have your papillary muscles. And so we're just cutting the heart like a loaf of bread, okay? And we need to look at the different segments. Okay, so we can put the muscle there, okay? Two papillary muscles. And at the base you have the mitral valve. If it's some literature, some material will put the mitral valve in like that, okay? So this is at the mid segment. You can write mid, okay? All right, so we're going to divide the mid segment also into 6 segments. 6 segments. And the beauty about that, the mid segments have the same name of the segments as the base. Okay? Same as the base. So it is named the same way. So this is your anterior wall up top, inferior wall there. This is the lateral wall. So this is the anterior lateral wall, inferior lateral wall. Over here we have the septum. This is your anterior septum and inferior septum. Okay? So again, your bread loaf in the heart, you start at the base, the mid segment, then you come to the apex. So the apex, we will come now to the apex. So the apex is smaller than the others. So we can, the apex look like this. Okay. All right. So the apex only have 4 segments. The apex have only 4 segments, unlike the base and the mid cavity. So for the apex, this is your anterior wall. It has an inferior wall down here. Over here, this is your lateral wall, and over here is the septum. Okay? So we divide the different areas of the heart into segments. So this is short axis, of course. Short axis when we bread loaf the heart. We can also, well, not we can, we divide the apical 4-chamber view into segments. So remember what your apical 4-chamber view looks like, and let's see if we can draw that. So your apical 4-chamber view, okay, so you have your, okay. So again, this is the left side of the heart over here. This is the lateral wall. This is your apex, and this is your septum. So again, this is the lateral wall. This is the septum right there, and this is the apex. So when we just look at the lateral wall, this is the mitral valve right there. So the lateral wall closest to the mitral valve, that's a basal segment. So this little area over here is your basal lateral wall. Okay, this is the basal lateral wall. Because remember, anything close to the mitral valve is the base of the heart, the base. So that's why, and this is the lateral, it's a basolateral wall. Further up, you have the mid. So this is the mid-lateral wall right here. Mid-lateral wall. And then this segment is close to the apex, so we call this apical lateral wall. So this is the apical lateral wall. Okay, now when you come to the septum, okay, again, the portion that's closest to the mitral valve is the basal. So this is this right here, this segment right down here is the basal septum. Okay, so this, the first segment, is a basal septum. So BS. And then, of course, this is going to be your mid, because it's where you'd find the papilloma. So right here is your mid septum, so MS. And then up here, this is your apical septum. So AS, apical septum. Okay, so that is how you divide the LV, the left ventricle, into segments. Again, all of this is the lateral wall, all of this is the septum. So this is your basal, your mid apical, basal, mid apical. Okay, all right, all right. We can also divide the apical two chamber into segments. Remember what the apical two chamber looks like? Okay, so your apical two chamber looks something like this. Okay, again, this is your anterior wall right up here, anterior wall, and this is the inferior wall. Okay, the lower portion close to the mitral valve, this would be, so this first segment gonna be your basal anterior wall, because it's closer to the mitral valve. Then you have the mid anterior wall right here. Okay, so this is the mid anterior wall. Then this segment is the apical anterior wall because it's at the apex. So apical anterior wall. So when we come now, this is the inferior wall, the portion of the inferior wall closest to the mitral valve is your basal inferior wall. So this is your basal inferior wall. This portion is the mid inferior wall. Mid inferior wall. And then this portion close to the apex, your apical inferior wall. Apical inferior wall. So we divide the heart into all the segments. You have to know the segments, and the reason for knowing the different segments is because they're usually supplied by different blood vessels. They have different blood supply. You can look at a segment, and if the segment is not moving well, you can predict the blood vessel that is involved in that process. So this is basically how we divide the heart into segments. All right, so let's all right, so this is what the literature have. Okay, again, the apex, your bread loaf in the heart. So you divide the apex into four segments: the anterior wall, inferior wall, lateral wall, septal wall or septum. In the mid cavity level, you have the papillary muscles. The anterior wall is up there, inferior wall is there. This is all lateral wall. Closer to the anterior wall, you have the anterior lateral wall. Down here, you have your inferior lateral wall. Over here, where you have the septum, this is your inferior septum. This is the anterior septum. This is at the base where you have your mitral valve. That you divide in the same way you look at the same way you divide the basal segment, the basal wall into segment, the same way you do it for the base. Anterior wall, inferior wall. This is the lateral wall. So this is the anterior lateral, inferior lateral. This is a septum, inferior septum, anterior septum. So the short axis, this is how you divide the short axis into segments. Okay. So the short axis. Now, when we come to the four chamber view, remember what we said. This is the lateral wall over here. This is the septum. The mitral valve is right there. So this is your basal lateral wall, mid and apical. Okay, and for the septum, basal, mid, apical. We talk about the apical cap. So, if you look at the apex, you can just cut the top off. If you look right here, you can just cut this off, and that's the apical cap. Okay, for your two chamber view, the anterior wall is there, anterior wall. This is the inferior wall. Okay, so for the anterior wall, you have basal anterior wall, mid anterior wall, apical anterior wall. For the inferior wall, basal, mid, and apical. And they also use the apical three chamber view. So this is your anterior septum, and this is your inferior lateral wall. Anterior septum, inferior lateral. And you divide it the same way. Basal, mid, apical. Basal, mid, apical. So I'm going to let you guys go over this so you fully understand it. And then when we come back, we'll talk about wall motion. We'll talk about the blood supply to the different segments, and we'll talk about wall motion score index. So go over the segments, fully understand the segments, and then we'll add something more to this at our next session. Okay? All right. Good night.